For 30 years, Frank Miller arrived at Lincoln High School every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, unlocked the custodial closet, and began his quiet routine of keeping the school clean. Students rushing to first period would pass him in the hallways without a second glance. Just the old janitor with his mop bucket and cart working silently in the background of their teenage lives. Teachers appreciated his reliability but rarely engaged him in conversation beyond a polite good morning. Until Tuesday, November 8th, 1994, when history teacher Mr. Roberts was explaining D-Day to his sophomore class and said the words that would change everything. Of course, nobody alive today really knows what it was like to storm those beaches. That's when Frank Miller, standing in the doorway with his mop, spoke for the first time in 3 decades of service. I was there. The classroom fell silent as the man who had cleaned their floors for 30 years revealed he had once stormed Omaha Beach at 19 years old. Welcome to Forgotten Heroes Stories. Before we continue this incredible story of hidden history and the moment when textbook knowledge met lived experience, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like Frank's deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. These voices matter, and your support helps us honor the greatest generation. Lincoln High School had been Frank Miller's world since 1964, when he started working as head custodian at age 40. The 2-story brick building housed 800 students, 43 teachers, and countless memories. But Frank moved through it all like a ghost, present, essential, but largely unseen by the community he served. Frank's routine never varied. He arrived before dawn to start the boilers, check the heating system, and prepare the building for another day of education. By 7 a.m., when the first teachers began arriving, Frank had already swept the main hallways, emptied the office trash cans, and restocked the restrooms. He worked with quiet efficiency, timing his tasks to avoid disrupting classes, appearing and disappearing from corridors like smoke. Students at Lincoln High knew him simply as Mr. Frank, or sometimes just the janitor. He was part of the school's infrastructure, as reliable and unremarkable as the heating system or the bell schedule. They'd see him pushing his cart through the halls, cleaning up after their messes, fixing broken lockers, but few ever really looked at him. To them, he was just another adult employee, perhaps someone's grandfather who needed a job to supplement his retirement income. The faculty treated Frank with polite respect but maintained professional distance. He wasn't invited to staff meetings or school social events. He ate his lunch alone in the boiler room, reading newspapers or paperback novels. When teachers needed something, a spill cleaned up, a broken desk fixed, or a classroom unlocked, they'd find Frank and make their request. He'd nod quietly, say, "I'll take care of it," and the task would be completed without fanfare. What none of them knew was that Frank Miller carried more history in his worn work boots than all of Lincoln High School's textbooks combined. The hands that pushed the mop bucket had once gripped an M1 Garand rifle. The eyes that watched teenagers hurry to their lockers had once seen the coast of Nazi-occupied France emerging through morning mist. The quiet man in the gray uniform had lived through one of the most significant days in human history, but he'd never spoken a word about it to anyone at the school. Mr. David Roberts had been teaching American history at Lincoln High for 12 years, and he prided himself on making the past come alive for his students. His classroom, room 237, was decorated with historical maps, vintage posters, and reproductions of important documents. He was the kind of teacher who acted out Civil War battles and spoke in different accents when discussing various historical figures. Roberts was passionate about World War II, particularly the European theater. He'd read dozens of books about D-Day, watched every documentary he could find, and even planned someday to visit the beaches of Normandy. To him, June 6, 1944, represented the pinnacle of American courage and determination. The day when ordinary young men accomplished something extraordinary. His sophomore American history class was studying World War II in November 1994, 50 years after the events they were discussing. The students, 16-year-olds born in 1978, found the war almost incomprehensibly distant. To them, 1944 might as well have been the Civil War or the Revolutionary War. It was all just history, names and dates and battles that had happened to other people in another world. Can anyone tell me why D-Day was so significant? Roberts asked his second-period class on that Tuesday morning. A few hands went up. It was when we invaded France, offered Sarah Chen, a serious student in the front row. Good start. And why was that important, Marcus? Marcus Williams, a football player who usually struggled with history, thought for a moment. Because it opened up a second front? So Germany had to fight on two sides? Exactly right, Roberts said, turning to write on the blackboard. The Normandy invasion was the largest seaborne assault in history. Over 150,000 Allied troops landed on 5 beaches along the French coast. He drew a simple map of the Normandy coastline, marking the 5 landing zones: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The most difficult landing was at Omaha Beach, where American forces faced the heaviest German defenses. Casualties were severe. Some estimates suggest that over 2,400 American soldiers died that day. The classroom was unusually quiet. Even students who typically whispered during lectures were paying attention to Roberts' description of the invasion. What we have to understand, Roberts continued, is the incredible courage it took for these young men, most of them not much older than you are now, to charge across an open beach into machine gun fire. Of course, nobody alive today really knows what that was like. We can read accounts, watch interviews with veterans, but the actual experience of storming those beaches, that's when he heard the voice from the doorway. I was there. The words were spoken quietly, but in the sudden silence of room 237, they carried with perfect clarity. Every head in the classroom turned toward the door, where Frank Miller stood with his mop bucket beside him, gray uniform neat as always, looking directly at Mr. Roberts with an expression that was both calm and profound. Roberts blinked, certain he had misheard. I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. Did you say something? Frank stepped into the classroom, leaving his mop bucket in the hallway. For 30 years, he had never entered a classroom during instruction time. Teachers and students alike stared as the quiet janitor walked slowly toward the front of the room, his work boots making soft sounds on the linoleum floor. I said I was there, Frank repeated, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that none of them had ever heard before. Omaha Beach, June 6th, 1944. Second Wave, 116th Infantry Regiment. The silence that followed was profound. Roberts felt his mouth go dry. The students sat frozen in their desks, not understanding the full significance of what they were hearing, but sensing that something extraordinary was happening. You were, Roberts started, then stopped. Mr. Miller, are you saying you were at D-Day? Frank nodded once. I was 19 years old, from Lynchburg, Virginia, shipped out from England on a landing craft in the early morning hours, hit the beach around 7:30 a.m. Roberts stared at the man he'd worked alongside for 12 years, the quiet custodian who had never mentioned his past, never talked about anything more significant than broken light bulbs or floor wax. Why didn't you, in all these years, why didn't you ever say anything? Frank looked around the classroom at the faces staring back at him. Teenagers the same age he'd been when he'd waded through the surf at Omaha Beach. Because you never asked. And because it's not something you talk about casual-like. He walked over to Roberts's map of Normandy still drawn on the blackboard. With one weathered finger, he pointed to the section marked Omaha Beach. Right about here, he said quietly. Sector Dog Green. That's where my unit went in. Roberts quickly moved some student desks aside, making room for Frank at the front of the classroom. The lesson plan he'd prepared for that day was forgotten. Textbook knowledge had just been replaced by something far more valuable. Mr. Miller, Roberts said, his voice filled with new respect, would you be willing to tell us about it? Frank looked around the room again, at faces that were no longer looking through him, but at him, really seeing him for the first time. "I suppose," he said slowly, "if it helps them understand what those boys went through." He sat on the edge of Roberts's desk, a position he never would have presumed to take before this moment. When he spoke, his voice was clear and measured, as if he were reading a report rather than describing the most terrifying day of his life. "The water was rough that morning," he began. "Waves 6, maybe 7 feet high. Half the boys in our landing craft were seasick before we even saw the beach. LST, landing ship tank, that's what carried us across the channel. We'd been up all night, checking equipment, writing letters home, trying not to think too hard about what was coming." Sarah Chen raised her hand tentatively. "Were you scared?" Frank looked at her, the serious 16-year-old, and for a moment saw himself at 19, young, uncertain, trying to be brave. "Terrified," he said simply. "Anyone who tells you they weren't scared is either lying or wasn't really there." "What did the beach look like when you first saw it?" asked Marcus Williams. "Like hell," Frank said, then glanced at Roberts apologetically. "Sorry for the language, but that's the truth of it." The first wave had gone in 30 minutes before us, and we could see the smoke and hear the gunfire. Bodies in the water, equipment scattered on the sand, and above it all, the sound of those German machine guns. Frank paused, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the classroom walls, beyond Lincoln High School, beyond 1994. He was seeing Omaha Beach on a June morning 50 years ago. The ramp on our landing craft dropped, and Sergeant Morrison, he was from Alabama, had a wife and 2 little girls back home. Sergeant Morrison was the first one off. He made it maybe 10 steps before a machine gun burst cut him down. The classroom was completely silent. Even students who typically couldn't sit still for 5 minutes were motionless, hanging on every word. "That's when you learn what courage really is," Frank continued. "It's not being afraid. It's being scared to death and going forward anyway, because the man next to you is counting on you, and you're counting on him." Roberts sat in one of the student desks, no longer the teacher but a student himself, learning about history from someone who had lived it. The 43-year-old educator realized that in 12 years of teaching about D-Day, he had never truly understood what he was teaching about. "How far did you make it up the beach?" Roberts asked. "About 200 yards before we found cover behind some tank obstacles," Frank said. "There was a seawall there, maybe 4 feet high, made of concrete and steel. We stayed there for I don't know how long. Time moved different when people were shooting at you." "What happened next?" asked Jennifer Lopez, a quiet student who rarely spoke in class. Frank looked at her kindly. "We waited for the Rangers to clear out some of the machine gun nests on the bluffs above us. Took about 2 hours. During that time, we tried to help the wounded, tried to keep our weapons clean, tried not to think about home." He paused, studying the faces around him. "You know what I thought about, sitting behind that seawall with German bullets flying over our heads?" The students shook their heads. "I thought about my high school," Frank said. "Lincoln County High School in Virginia. I thought about my history teacher, Mr. Peterson, and how he'd taught us about the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. I wondered if someday students would sit in classrooms like this one and learn about what we were doing on that beach." The impact of his words hit the classroom like a physical force. These students were sitting in a classroom learning about D-Day from someone who had been there, someone who had thought about classrooms like theirs while bullets flew around him. "Did many of your friends," Sarah started, then stopped, not sure how to finish the question. Frank understood. "We lost a lot of good boys that day. My unit, Company A of the 116th Infantry, we started with about 35 men. By nightfall, we had maybe 20 still able to fight." Roberts felt compelled to ask, How do you carry something like that? Frank was quiet for a long moment. Some days better than others, he said finally. For a long time, I thought the best way to honor the ones who didn't make it home was to live quietly, not make a fuss, just do my work and try to be a good man. He looked around the room again. But maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe the best way to honor them is to make sure people like you understand what they gave up, what freedom cost. The bell that usually ended second period rang, but no one moved. Students who normally bolted for the door the moment class was over sat still, unwilling to break the spell that had settled over room 237. Roberts made a quick decision. I'm going to call the office and ask if we can extend this period. Is that all right with everyone? The response was unanimous, heads nodding, murmured agreements. Even students who typically complained about history class wanted to hear more. Frank looked surprised. I don't want to keep you from your other classes. Mr. Miller, said Marcus Williams, this is more important than algebra. Over the next 45 minutes, Frank answered questions these teenagers had never thought to ask. About the food they ate, cold rations when they could get them. About sleeping, on the ground, often in the rain, always listening for enemy movement. About fear, constant, but you learned to function despite it. About friendship, bonds formed in combat that nothing else could match. What happened after D-Day? Asked Tom Rodriguez, a student who usually spent history class doodling in his notebook. We fought across France, Frank said. Through hedgerow country, then Belgium, finally into Germany itself. Took 11 months to get from Normandy to Berlin. I was lucky, made it all the way to the end without getting seriously wounded. When did you come home? Asked Sarah. February 1946. Took a troop ship from Le Havre to New York, then a train to Virginia. My mama was waiting at the station in Lynchburg. Frank's voice softened. She'd gotten older while I was gone, they all had. What was it like coming home? Roberts asked. Frank considered the question carefully. Strange, he said finally. Everything looked the same, but I felt different. Like I'd seen things that changed me, but nobody else could see it. People would ask, how was the war? Like I'd been on vacation. What do you say to that? The classroom was quiet again. Students beginning to understand that the old janitor carried more than just the memory of battle. He carried the weight of returning to a world that couldn't comprehend what he'd experienced. Is that why you never talked about it? Asked Jennifer. Because people wouldn't understand? Partly, Frank admitted. But mostly because the boys who didn't make it home, they couldn't tell their stories. Seemed wrong for me to talk about myself when they were the real heroes. Robert shook his head. Mr. Miller, with all due respect, you are a real hero. You served your country, you survived something terrible, and you came home and built a life. That's heroic. Frank looked uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what anyone would do. No, said Marcus firmly. Most people wouldn't have gotten off that landing craft. Most people wouldn't have made it across the beach. Most people, added Sarah, wouldn't have spent 30 years quietly serving our school after serving their country. Word of what had happened in room 237 spread through Lincoln High School with the speed that only truly remarkable news can achieve. By lunchtime, teachers were stopping Frank in the hallways, not to ask him to clean something, but to shake his hand and thank him for his service. Students who had walked past him for years without a second glance now looked at him with new eyes. Principal Margaret Hayes called Frank to her office, not because he was in trouble, but because she wanted to understand how her school's custodian had been carrying such extraordinary history without anyone knowing about it. Frank, she said, using his first name for the first time in 30 years, why didn't you ever tell us you were a veteran? We have Veterans Day assemblies every year. We could have honored your service. Frank sat in the chair across from her desk, still wearing his gray custodian's uniform, but somehow carrying himself differently, straighter, more present. "Mrs. Hayes, I didn't take this job to be honored. I took it to work, to be useful. But don't you think the students could benefit from hearing your experiences, from learning history from someone who lived it?" Frank thought about the faces in room 237, the questions they'd asked, the way they'd listened with attention he'd never seen them give to textbooks or documentaries. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe they could." That afternoon, Frank received his first visitor in the custodial office, Mr. Roberts, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of someone who had just had his worldview fundamentally shifted. "Frank," Roberts said, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For 12 years of treating you like furniture. For never bothering to learn who you really are." Roberts set one of the coffee cups on Frank's workbench. "I teach history, but I never thought to ask if I was working alongside someone who had made history." Frank accepted the coffee gratefully. "You had no reason to ask. I'm just the janitor." "No," Roberts said firmly. "You're a World War II veteran who has been quietly serving this school for 3 decades. You're a living link to one of the most important events in human history, and you're someone I'd like to get to know better, if you'll let me." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 men who had worked in the same building for 12 years, but were meeting for the first time. "David," Frank said finally, using the teacher's first name, "there's something else you should know." Roberts looked up expectantly. "I've been listening to your history lessons for years, walking past your classroom, hearing you teach about the war." Frank smiled slightly. "You do a good job. You make those kids care about things that happened before they were born. That's not easy. But I've been teaching from books and movies. You lived it." Books and movies. Over the next few days, Roberts found himself thinking constantly about the conversation in the custodial office. He'd spent his entire teaching career trying to make history relevant to teenagers who saw the past as ancient and irrelevant. Now he had discovered that authentic, lived history had been walking the halls of his school for 30 years. On Friday, Roberts approached Principal Hayes with a proposal. "I'd like to invite Frank to be a guest speaker for all our American history classes," he said. "Not just about D-Day, but about his entire war experience. And maybe about what it was like coming home and building a life after something like that." Hayes was immediately supportive. "I think that's an excellent idea. Have you talked to Frank about it?" "Not yet. I wanted to clear it with you first. But Mrs. Hayes, I think this could be bigger than just my classes. This could be a school-wide assembly. Maybe invite the community." How often do we get the chance to hear firsthand from someone who was actually there? "What do you think Frank would say?" Robert smiled. "I think he'd say he's just the janitor and doesn't need any fuss made over him. But I also think, deep down, he wants these kids to understand what his generation went through, what they sacrificed." That afternoon, Roberts and Hayes together approached Frank in his office. When they explained their idea, a Veterans Day assembly where Frank would be the featured speaker, his first response was exactly what Roberts had predicted. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not a speaker, I'm just the janitor." "Frank," Hayes said gently, "you may be our custodian, but you're also a war hero, and more than that, you're someone these students trust. They see you every day, you're part of their world. If you tell them about D-Day, they'll listen in a way they might not listen to a stranger." "Besides," Roberts added, "you did fine in my classroom. Better than fine. You made that history real for those kids in a way I never could." Frank was quiet for a long moment, considering. "What would I say to a whole auditorium of people?" "The same thing you said to my class," Roberts suggested. "The truth. Your experience. What you saw, what you felt, what you learned. And maybe," Hayes added, "what you've learned from 30 years of serving this school. about different kinds of service, different ways of making a contribution. Frank looked at them both, these colleagues who had worked alongside him for years but were only now beginning to see him clearly. "If you think it would help the students understand," he said finally, "then I suppose I could try." The Lincoln High School auditorium was packed on November 11th, 1994. Students filled the seats, teachers lined the walls, and community members, including several local veterans who had heard about Frank's story, occupied the back rows. A simple podium had been set up on the stage with an American flag to one side and a banner reading "Honoring Our Veterans" stretched across the back wall. Principal Hayes introduced Frank with words that still amazed everyone who heard them. "Today, we're honored to hear from someone who has been part of our school family for 30 years. Mr. Frank Miller has cleaned our classrooms, fixed our equipment, and kept our school running. What we didn't know until this week is that before he served Lincoln High School, he served his country on the beaches of Normandy." Frank walked to the podium wearing his best clothes, a navy suit he'd bought for his wife's funeral years earlier, a white shirt and a tie the color of autumn leaves. In his lapel was a small pin that most people had never seen him wear, a Purple Heart. He looked out at the assembled crowd, hundreds of faces, most of them young, all of them focused on him with attention he'd never experienced in 30 years of quiet service. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "Mrs. Hayes asked me to talk about my war service, but I want to start by talking about service itself." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "For 30 years I've worked in this building. I've cleaned up after you, fixed things when they broke, and tried to keep this place running so you could learn and grow. Some of you might wonder why a man would be content to mop floors and empty trash cans for 3 decades. Frank looked directly at the student section. "It's because service comes in many forms. In 1944, I served my country by carrying a rifle on a beach in France. Since 1964, I've served my community by maintaining the school where your futures are being shaped. Both kinds of service matter. Both have value." The auditorium was completely silent. "But today I want to tell you about June 6, 1944, because I think it's important for you to understand what freedom costs." For the next 45 minutes, Frank told his story, not as a hero seeking recognition, but as a witness to history sharing what he had seen. He talked about the landing craft crossing the English Channel, about the machine gun fire on Omaha Beach, about friends who didn't make it home. He talked about courage and fear, about duty and sacrifice, about the bonds formed between men who faced death together. But he also talked about coming home, about the challenge of returning to normal life after experiencing something extraordinary. He talked about the importance of quiet service, of finding ways to contribute without seeking glory. "The boys who died on that beach," Frank concluded, "they gave up their futures so you could have yours. The best way to honor them is to make something meaningful of the lives they made possible." The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt. But more importantly, Frank could see in the faces looking back at him that something had changed. These students would never again see him as just the janitor. They would remember that ordinary people can carry extraordinary stories, that heroes don't always look like heroes, and that service comes in many forms. Frank Miller continued working as Lincoln High School's custodian for 3 more years before retiring in 1997. But those final years were different from the 30 that had preceded them. Students no longer walked past him without acknowledgement. Teachers made time for conversations. The school community had finally learned to see the man they had overlooked for decades. Every Veterans Day from 1994 until his retirement, Frank was the featured speaker at Lincoln High's assembly. Each year he would tell different parts of his story, not just about D-Day, but about the entire war, about coming home, about choosing service over recognition. Graduating classes would often invite him to speak at their ceremonies, asking him to remind them about the value of quiet contribution. Mr. Roberts began incorporating Frank's first-hand accounts into his regular curriculum. With Frank's permission, he recorded several hours of interviews, creating an oral history that would be preserved for future students. The classroom where Frank had first broken his silence was designated the Frank Miller Memorial Classroom after his death in 2003. But perhaps Frank's greatest legacy was the lesson he taught about recognition itself. For 30 years he had been present, essential, and overlooked. His story reminded everyone that extraordinary people often hide in plain sight, doing ordinary work with extraordinary dedication. The students who heard Frank speak went on to their own lives and careers, but many carried with them a new awareness of the people around them. They learned to look more carefully at the janitors and cafeteria workers and bus drivers who kept their worlds functioning. They understood that service comes in many forms, and that some of the most important contributions are made by people who never ask for applause. David Roberts retired from teaching in 2010, but he often said that his conversation with Frank Miller in that custodial office had been the most important moment of his educational career. "I thought I was teaching history," he would tell new teachers, "but I learned that history was teaching me." The Lincoln High School custodial office still bears a small plaque that reads, "Frank Miller served here from 1964 to 1997. He served his country at Omaha Beach and his community in these halls. Both forms of service honored us all." The heroes of the greatest generation didn't disappear when the war ended. They became teachers and postmen, mechanics and janitors, neighbors and friends who spent their entire lives serving their communities in quiet, unglamorous ways. They carried extraordinary stories while doing ordinary work, and most of them never thought their experiences were worth talking about. Frank Miller mopped floors for 30 years before anyone thought to ask about his past. How many other Frank Millers work in our schools, our hospitals, our communities? How many extraordinary stories are being carried by people we see every day but never really notice? The janitor cleaning your office building might have stormed a beach in Normandy. The crossing guard at your child's school might have flown bombing missions over Germany. The person stocking shelves at your grocery store might have survived a prisoner of war camp. They're all around us, these quiet heroes, waiting not for recognition, but simply for someone to ask the right question, to show genuine interest in their stories. Frank Miller's legacy isn't just about D-Day or World War II. It's about the importance of seeing the people around us, of recognizing that everyone has a story worth hearing, and of understanding that the most profound service often happens without fanfare or applause. So, I challenge you. Who are the Frank Millers in your world? The quiet people who keep things running, who show up consistently, who serve without seeking recognition. Take a moment to really see them. Ask about their stories. Thank them for their service, all kinds of service. Share their names in the comments below. Tell us about the custodians and cafeteria workers, the crossing guards and security officers who have touched your life. Let this be a place where ordinary heroes get the recognition they've never sought, but always deserved. Subscribe to Forgotten Heroes Stories. If you believe that every person has a story worth telling and that the greatest heroes often work in the shadows, hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories that remind us to look more carefully at the world around us. Tomorrow, we'll share another story of hidden heroism and quiet courage. Until then, remember, the most important history is often being made by the people we notice least. Thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing. And thank you for understanding that service comes in many forms, but it always begins with showing up and doing what needs to be done, whether anyone is watching or not.